All right, separation timing. Now this is probably the most important 3X Advanced component. Now, we haven't, within the 3X Advanced components, we really haven't gotten into specifically defining hip-shoulder separation because that was defined as one of the main components of 3X pitching along with triple extension. It's what took me down the road towards developing 3X pitching. Hip-to-shoulder separation is something I learned from the MPA and their case study in 2005-2006 that proved that 80% of your velocity comes from your ability to separate your hips from shoulders at front foot strike. That was very much revolutionary to me. It changed my game. Once I learned how to implement it and enhance it through triple extension, I learned, or I was able to do what doctors said I wouldn't do post-surgery, which was play baseball again and pitch well over 90 miles an hour. So it's very, very critical to velocity, and it's very, very critical even to arm health. So it's a very critical, important component, if I'm not making that obvious, right? So in measuring hip-to-shoulder separation, which more than likely if you followed me through my video analysis, you see I talk about it a lot. Basically, how I measure hip-to-shoulder separation is when our front foot lands and we have no lead knee flexion, meaning we've stabilized, we've stopped the movement, and then the hips have opened, which usually is an indication of that line down your pants or any other way you can, you know your hips are open. At that point, we then measure, we draw one line from the left to right hip, if you're a right-handed pitcher, one line from the left to right shoulder, and the degrees of separation between those two lines tells us what our hip-shoulder separation is. Many low-velocity pitchers have very little. We know that the major league pitcher is somewhere in that 40 to 60 degree range. The low-velocity pitcher I usually find is somewhere around the 15 to 20 degree range. But the hard thing here is sometimes, of course, to do this, to evaluate this and measure hip-to-shoulder separation in your delivery, you have to do it in video analysis. But a lot of times when we do it, we don't have the best footage, and we struggle with trying to find exactly where we are. And it really doesn't come down to an exact science. It just gives us an idea of what's going on. Well, separation timing gives us an even clearer picture. It brings in the timing aspects of it and gives us a little bit different perspective of how we need to understand it. And this is what makes it a critical component. And this component alone, it really defines 3X pitching. I mean, we understood that when I first talked about it in the main 6 components of 3X pitching. But this just kind of shows how even more important it is. All right, so how we measure hip-to-shoulder separation timing or separation timing, and you'll find that this is not something that I've just made up. It's actually documented. This technique has been used. You'll see how within the 3X Pitching Mechanics Guide, it's referenced to other case studies. So this is something that actually is used, and it's actually outside of 3X pitching is considered a way to measure your pitching velocity potential. So how we measure separation timing is what we need to look at within the 3X pitching. We define 2 phases. We define the stride phase, the front foot, throwing phase from front foot to pitch release. Separation, we know, is actually the moment that connects the 2 phases. So if you separate your stride phase from your throwing phase, you have more separation. And that's really what's critical about learning the 2-phase delivery. The better we separate it, the more hip-to-shoulder separation we have. And that's why it's such a critical component, because it's the connection between the 2 phases. So the bigger the margin of timing, the more we've separated the phases, the more velocity potential we have. But in measuring separation timing, we need to understand that we need to look at pretty much just the throwing phase at this point. Front foot has landed, stabilized, like we talk about, just regular separation. And then the end of the phase of the throwing phase is pitch release. So we're going to consider, or we're going to basically label the throwing phase as that's 100% of the movement, from front foot to pitch release. So within that phase, we're going to break it into percentages. So from the beginning, front foot, that's 0%. Pitch release would be 100% of that movement, okay? So measuring separation timing, we know, and we have studies that also show, high-velocity pitchers, they open their hips within the first 25 to 30% of that movement. Their hips have opened. Low-velocity pitchers, they go well into the 40, 50% of that movement. So they're opening their hips closer to pitch release. High velocity pitcher is actually opening their hips closer to front foot strike. So separation timing, we're going to get our hips open early. So we're measuring when those hips open, specifically when those hips peak. When the hip speeds peak, when we see that boom there in video, that moment we see it really peak, let's stop that frame. Okay, let's start at that point. That might be 25% hopefully into that movement following front foot strike. But wherever those hips peak, we're going to start there. Now we're going to count through that throwing phase to when the shoulder speeds peak. When we see this, shoulder speeds peak, it's usually at the point of the arm starting to go. So we're going to take the percentage within the movement of when the hips speeds peak and the percentage within the movement of when the shoulder speeds peak. We want a larger margin. So if the hip speeds peak to 25 or say 30% of the movement, and then the shoulder speeds peaked 60% of the movement before pitch release, then that would be a 30% margin, which is really, really good. So you'll see the high velocity pitcher has a margin of like 20 to 25%. So their hip speeds are like 25 and then peaking at 50% of the movement. That's a high velocity pitcher. A low velocity pitcher is going to peak, say, 40% into the movement, hip speeds peak. Then the shoulder speeds are going to peak, 55, 57, 58% of the movement. So somewhere in that, they say that 17% range would be a low velocity pitcher. So here's the problem. If you don't have a high-speed camera, you're not going to be able to measure this. Because when hip to shoulder separation is occurring, it's so quick, we're only getting 1 or 2 frames if it's 30 frames per second, whatever video you're using. It doesn't give enough time to measure much of a difference. Okay, so it's not going to be that correct. We can get high-speed camera around 100 frames a second. That's going to give us some frames to actually make an accurate measurement of separation timing. But you'll still see when using this method, in addition to measuring hip to shoulder positions, the front foot, like I do already in my analysis, it just gives you a better understanding of what's happening between the stride phase and the throwing phase. All right, so you can see how valuable that will be. Like I said, just use it as an additional, some added variables to the hip to shoulder separation equation for you to get a good understanding of what's going on. For example, if you see it looks like you got 40 degrees of separation, but when you're looking at the margin between hip peak speeds and shoulder peak speeds, you're barely seeing anything, there's a good chance you probably don't have the hip to shoulder separation you think you have. And if you want to get a high-speed camera at that point and then really measure the margin. So that's separation timing in a nutshell. You can see how valuable that is going to be to measuring your own pitching velocity potential. And of course, how we enhance that is all the components up to that moment of separation. Every component addressed in the 3X Pitching Mechanics Guide is going to help us. If we can speed those up, implement those effectively through an explosive movement, we're going to enhance hip to shoulder separation. So that's how we enhance it. And that's what we're doing every day through the 3X Pitching Velocity program. So now you have a good understanding of how to measure it and how we enhance it. And just know this too. If you haven't implemented it effectively, you don't need to work on anything after it. Because everything after it is not going to be impressive either. So if your hip to shoulder separation is poor, pretty much everything else is going to be poor. Unless you're really overcompensating to make up for it, but then you're going to see some issues with arm health from there on out. So the point is, you don't have good hip to shoulder separation timing, don't go ahead of yourself. Go back and get better up to that point. And once you've enhanced that and you've seen the improvements, then you can move on. All right, so that's separation timing.